Russian troops continue to flood into forbidden territory. More than ever, people are feeling threatened and afraid for Ukraine, as well as themselves. Propaganda and war footage are circulating rapidly, whipping many into an all-out frenzy. An all-too-common demand is circulating among Westerners to bring the country to its knees. More specifically, some are calling for an all-out invasion. It's important to clarify that invasions are defined by the objective. In this case, the goal would be to conquer, liberate, or establish authoritative control over the country in question. In the case of Russia, not only is this nearly impossible to achieve, but it would also be a big mistake, from bloodshed to logistics to the threat of total Armageddon. This is why invading Russia is a very bad idea. Believe it or not, Russia has always been seen as somewhat of a prize for millennia. To the uninitiated, conquest can seem like a sure thing. Their economy is often struggling, causing a collapse in their education system. With it, many young engineers who would otherwise be filling the shoes of the dead have left for greener pastures. This lack of funding has also led to a decline in infrastructure as well, with many relying on Soviet railways to transport essential goods. Next, they have an internationally recognized border of 13,923 miles in length. When paired with Kazakhstan, they rank second to the US and Canada. But, unlike their Western neighbors, they are famous for leaving this territory unfortified. For the most part, the doors of Russia remain open to their neighbors, and hostile parties can walk in at any moment. Let's also add population to the mix. About 143.4 million reside in the motherland. At first glance, it seems like a lot, but Russia is one of the most sparsely populated countries on the planet, beating Japan by less than 20 million people. Putting this into perspective, Siberia holds about 8 people per square mile. That doesn't even include the harsher climates deeper in the northern territory. Plus, with these 143.4 million, Ukraine, their greatest foe in the last decade, has managed to hold them off with a third of the force. Their equipment is old and slow, and the entire world has often marched against them. Again, on paper, it seems as if all major powers could and should take Russia in months. It's a 17 million square mile landmass with virtually all of its citizenry residing in small pockets like Moscow and industrial cities on the Barents Sea or eastern frontier. It possesses the Volga River, the longest river in Europe, which is also one of the most important aquatic transportation networks on the continent. Siberia, although underpopulated, is flush with natural resources: coal, petroleum, natural gas, diamonds, iron ore, and gold. This material abundance in Russian territory has led most nation-states to bend their knee to Russia as a trade boon. Its main export partners being China at 12%, Germany at 9%, the Netherlands at 8.4%, Italy at 5.8%, Belarus at 4.7%, Turkey at 4.4%, and Japan at 4.1%. Without the assistance of Eastern Europe's monolith, a major power vein could be severed, sending many into Stone Age-level darkness. In fact, that's exactly what's happening. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The ongoing conflict was the product of diplomatic dissolution stretching back to 2014. This attack is the largest one seen in the region since the Second World War, leading to a casualty count exceeding 500,000. All reports indicate that Russia is making headway, but the losses indicate that the country is far from being as strong as they said they were. And yet, from the years 862 to 2023, no power, no matter how resourceful and strong, has lived to tell the tale after waking the Bruin of Europe. At least not enough to qualify as a total success. Let's take a look at some of the most notable invasions over the years. The first and closest to near-perfect invasion attempt was conducted by the Mongols. At the time, the Russians were strictly referred to as Rus, peoples who reigned over Kievan Rus. The earliest recorded incident occurred in 1223, when generals Jib and Subutai traveled deep into Slavic lands with an estimated 30,000 men. The conflict peaked at the Battle of the Kalka River, where the Mongols laid waste to the bulk of the Rus forces. It's important to note that this was a time when early Russia stood as a loose confederation of principalities. It was a period when the lands of Ukraine and Russia stood together. At least that was the general consensus. In truth, Rus principalities might as well have been their own separate countries as they were controlled by individual kingdoms: Kiev, Galicia Volhynia, Novgorod Republic, Smolensk, Rostov, and others. Each kingdom was ruled by a dubious noble with high hopes that they could take advantage after their neighbors suffered a devastating raid. When the warriors of the steppe returned to their homes, it was assumed that the Jib and Subutai got everything they wanted. To this day, it's still argued whether or not the first hordes marched on Rus for reconnaissance or recruitment. Whatever the case, the Mongols had been planning to invade for many years. Now they had what they needed. Between 1237 and 1241, Batu Khan destroyed Kievan Rus, starting the invasion with around 40,000 mounted archers. Batu Khan's army would eventually be known universally as the Golden Horde, and their residual power loomed over Russian lands for the next 300 years. The nature of the invasion is a complicated topic among historians, and whether or not this qualifies as a successful invasion of the Russian state we know today is a hotly debated subject. It isn't even clear how many perished. Casualty estimations range from 500,000 to half of the Rus population. Also, not every kingdom was fully conquered. In fact, resistance to the occupation persisted well past Batu's initial march. Throughout the presence of the Tartar yoke, Russia was always in a state of partial subjugation. More often than not, hordes would collaborate with various groups and share the spoils, eventually dissolving into a cluster of Turkic tribes and their tributaries. Arguably, Mongol involvement only helped build a stronger foundation for Slavic people, bringing about the first signs of a singular unified country, albeit halting previous technological advancements. The centuries following Bhutan saw the growth of the Russian identity as a whole. It was no longer a state compromised of fledgling monarchies. Rulers like Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar, introduced a new Russia to the world stage. It was an empire, forged in the fires of a seemingly perpetual conflict on all sides. There were a handful of notable invasion attempts, including Sweden's surprising defeat at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, but they only strengthened Russian resolve. In reference to the Swedish campaign, Peter the Great's Victoria against Charles XII added Finland to the growing country's landmass. By the dawn of the 19th century, Russia had more than doubled its population from 15.5 to 42.8 million by 1812. Now it was time to face a new foe capable of taking the whole of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. Initially, relations between the French and Russian empires seemed positive after the Treaty of Tilsit on July 7, 1807. However, over the next 5 years, diplomatic failures soured relations. Napoleon's continental system, a massive blockade against Britain, made reconciliation impossible. By 1810, Russia's national debt had reached approximately 1,300%, as well as a 40% decrease in exports by 1812. After Napoleon discovered that Russia resumed trade with Britain to avoid economic destruction, the new emperor started raising troops in the Duchy of Warsaw. It was known as the Grand Army, made up of 600,000 men, the largest military body Western Europe had ever summoned. And yet, after making a formidable peace with Sweden and the Ottoman Empire, Russia would show everyone how far they were willing to go to preserve their legacy. On the 24th of June, Napoleon's troops marched into the belly of the beast. The assumption was that the campaign would be over in less than 2 months. However, French forces didn't account for a long-standing tradition solidified by Peter the Great, the scorched earth policy. Russian generals, particularly Barclay de Tolly, understood that the best course of action was to retreat. As they ran, all farmlands and resources were taken or destroyed, and Napoleon found himself 250 miles deep in foreign territory. Contrary to popular belief, it was the summer that made the first notable dent in Napoleon's Grand Army. Disease swept through the camps, and attritional losses were high. At one point, the Grand Army was losing 1,000 horses per day. Cossacks, a product of Mongol and Turkish influence, also proved to be a problematic foe, as their tactics were elusive and lethal. By the time Napoleon pulled out of Moscow, Russia had taken 500,000 lives. Weather and land were about to finish the job. Napoleon found himself exiled after the War of the Sixth Coalition. The country of Russia was about to see an onslaught of revolutionary activity, but it was once again safe from harm. As the ever-quotable Mark Twain once said, history never repeats itself, but it does often rhyme. In 1922, Russia's chain of revolutionary activity saw the end of the Tsarist rule and the birth of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR. Over the course of a century, the population had ballooned to about 130 million. When dust kicked up by the internal discourse settled in 1924, Joseph Stalin was at the helm, and the continent was looking at a Russia they had never seen before. Just 3 years later, Germans angered by post-war disparity opened a book called Mein Kampf. In it, soon-to-be dictator Adolf Hitler would express the desire to take the whole of Russia for Lebensraum, or living space. The difference between Hitler and Napoleon, or even the Mongols, was how the land would be used after the plan's success. For Napoleon, it seemed to be a point of pride and a hunger for conquest. For the Mongols, it was a land ripe for raids and unstable vassalage. For Adolf Hitler, it was a racial war with a racial vision. He saw a labor force, now 195.4 million strong, that would help build a new home for the German people. On Sunday, June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. It would prove to be the largest and bloodiest land offensive ever recorded. Stalin had heard whispers about a possible invasion, and weapon production was at an all-time high. In fact, by the end of the war, the Soviet Union had produced 516,648 artillery guns, 119,769 tanks and self-propelled weapons, and 213,742 military aircraft. However, much of it was poorly made, and Germany's initial charge was absolutely devastating. By Christmas 1941, the Nazis had captured about 3 million Russian soldiers. At first, it appeared as if Hitler's Third Reich had found the secret to finally conquering the Unconquerable, but there were a few mistakes that ultimately proved to be fatal. One was the number of men that they'd be fighting. Even with hundreds of thousands of men dying in their POW camps, German leadership still felt like they made very little progress. Also, the land that they covered on their way to Moscow saw pockets of Soviet resistance, jeopardizing supply lines in the process. While the Germans scrambled to pick up the pieces, the Soviets were provided with their most precious asset: time. Ally support from Britain also played a big role, as much-needed weapon infusion came just as Russians were low on firepower. Believing that Japan was no longer a threat, veteran forces were moved to the west, who had extensive experience with winter warfare. The turning point was when the Germans, while fighting the harsh Russian snowstorms, faced the Soviet winter counteroffensive on December 5th. The distance between the Nazis and Moscow grew from 15 miles to 62 to 155 miles. Subsequent offensives proved equally problematic. Groups such as the 7th Panzer Division saw a 64% casualty rate and a 95% material loss by late January. This was by far the most harmful invasion attempt Russia had ever faced. By the end of the fourth phase of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union was severely wounded. World War II was a meat grinder. 8.7 million soldiers had perished, along with 19 million civilian casualties. A quarter of the USSR was either wounded or killed. However, yet again, Russia still stood and became a superpower in the New World Order. Since the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, people have forgotten what has made Russia penetrable but never conquerable. But times have changed, so it raises the question, how possible is Russia to invade today? In truth, Russia is probably more difficult to invade than ever before, and here are the reasons to support that fact. For starters, if one were to consider marching into Russia, it's best to prepare to fight more than a third of the world. Russia has remained close to India and China. There are a few reasons why this happens to be the case. For one, they share societal values and economic interests, which has led to India recently accepting the rupee as tender for trade. But most importantly, the three countries, particularly Russia and China, have faced enormous pressure from Western Europe and the United States, not only from the ruling governments, but from the people they represent. Tensions are incredibly high, and it's not a stretch to assume how alliances will form if someone chooses to throw down the gauntlet. China holds a predominantly male population of about 1,425,671,000, 17.72% of the world's people. India, currently the most populous country, was reported to have 1,400,000,000 425,775,850 at the end of April this year. With the understandable assumption that others would join Russia as well, body count alone would make conquest virtually impossible. At this point, it's pretty clear that Russia isn't the most organized military body on the planet. While fighting in Ukraine, they have been using equipment dating back as far as the 1940s. Some of these include the T-62 tank, the D-1 howitzer, the PaK-50, the M212 gun, and the T-54 and 55 tanks, both of which were first developed in World War II. That said, past wars have shown that the Russian military, if provided even the slightest bit of breathing room, is one of the most adaptable aggregates in history. Field-ready equipment is in the tens of thousands. Even now, the country has learned from mistakes like the supply shortage facing the Germans and keeps massive Cold War stockpiles in the event of a global conflict. There's also the real elephant in the room, Armageddon. Russia possesses a total of 5,889 nuclear warheads. Of those, there are 1,674 deployed missiles ready to be launched in the wake of a major threat. That's enough to make any invader realize that taking Moscow, unlike in previous conflicts, could result in the end of the world. One of the greatest, and perhaps the most well-known obstacle, is the size of Russia and its temperamental terrain. Both Napoleon and Hitler experienced what some refer to as the invisible line. Once your troops get about 250 miles past the border of Belarus, time is your enemy. Many will say that the winters are the main danger. Although it's partially true, it's actually the fluctuation between warm and cold during seasonal changes. That makes invading a total nightmare. The transition from marshland to complete frost will involve a lot of thawing and freezing. Ironically, Russia's faulty infrastructure is one of the most valuable assets. Hypothetically, even if one reached the secured Moscow, the entire country's distance from east to west is about 5,600 miles. Without established roads, it would take almost a century to survey absolutely everything. In the north, a 4,970-mile ice pack that even Russian oil tankers struggle with prevents the likelihood of a naval assault. To the south, the land beyond Mongolia reaches altitudes capable of exhausting even the most athletic special forces. Also, the Caucasus Mountains, reaching approximately 18,510 feet, will prevent anyone from moving west to try the same. There's no soft underbelly on this border. Sure, maybe one could try moving from the east through Alaska, but the Sea of Okhotsk won't make for an easy crossing. And success would only lead to a march that very few backpackers have even survived. Let's say an invader manages to find a solution to all of the former problems. In this hypothetical reality, all allies turn a blind eye. Your artillery can fight the thaw and frost, and the massive stockpile of weapons and nukes mysteriously vanishes. There still remains one last obstacle standing between an invading force and 6,602 million square miles of prime real estate: the Russian people. This may seem like an easy task initially, but every army has come to learn that no matter how much they dislike their ruling government, the Russian populace will take death over surrender any day of the week. The geographical diversity in Russia can be held up to any other country in the world. At the moment, the landmass has 193 ethnic groups. Among these groups, over 270 languages and dialects are spoken. Some of these people don't consider themselves part of the Russian fabric, but it's safe to say that they wouldn't take kindly to foreign invaders. The natives in each region have also acclimated to the harsh climate, which is how many Russian soldiers were still able to fend off the Nazis without proper clothing. To put it into perspective, even President Vladimir Putin partakes in an annual Orthodox Epiphany ceremony, where men drop into Lake Seliger. The water usually holds at a steady 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Although rich in natural resources, the poverty levels among 74.5 million Russians are troubling. A report made in 2022 showed that they were all surviving on an annual household income of about $7,873.85 per capita. This has led Western nations to believe that they could stop trading with Russia to weaken them. Oddly enough, this could not be further from the truth, as poverty is somewhat of a Russian strength. Up until 1917, serfdom was widespread. Russians didn't have property, let alone a stable income. For years, World War II soldiers survived solely on Tashanka crackers and condensed milk. They would put sawdust in their bread during the siege of Leningrad to give everything more volume. Economic hardship could never be weaponized against Russian patriotism. Speaking of production, much of the populated Russian landscape is either industrial or agricultural. That said, most of the territories aren't arable, meaning that farming isn't easy. Because of this, the Russian people have adapted to scarcity, and, just like in Leningrad, they know how to make do with what they have. So much so that they're perfectly okay with burning everything down if any invaders were to take it. In World War I, although many Western powers practiced something similar, the Russian troops destroyed a chain of resources spanning a 600-mile front. They did the same in World War II. When Nazi troops moved eastward, Stalin sent 6 million cattle and 3.5 million skilled laborers into Republic territory. They went even as far as to have a bomb squad mine the Dormition Cathedral, a famous architectural monument built in 1073, later blown up to kill invaders. At every turn, no matter how valuable, the Russian people will not hesitate to destroy assets before the enemy can exploit them, even if it means that later recovery will be arduous and painful. All too often, foreign powers account for weather, supply chains, allies, and terrain, but fail to recognize that the hardship gene lies deep in the bones of Russia. They would rather see a conflagration without the land than surrender their home to someone else. At this point, it's not just a practice, it's a tradition. And now imagine if there was not just one, but two more Russias. Let's take a look at two more countries boasting similar difficulties to Russia. There are plenty of countries that can be compared to Russia, but very few are as similar as Afghanistan and China. Starting with Afghanistan, this may be a bit of a surprise considering their history with one another, but the adaptive strength of the two has become legendary during the 20th and 21st centuries. Not only do their mountains pose a significant threat to heavy weaponry, but the heat in the Oxus regions can reach anywhere between 113 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature variation is actually wider than what is found in Slavic countries. The plains can reach as low as 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and the mountains can go as low as -4 degrees Fahrenheit. This isn't even accounting for the inhabitants of this unforgiving landscape. The people also hold a similar territorial philosophy to that of the Russians. The land, just like Russia, is inhabited by various ethnic groups who will not hesitate to wreak havoc when occupied. As for China, these neighbors have an ancient history. China can also be considered unconquerable, but there are different reasons for this. It's not the philosophy of the Chinese citizenry that makes it impossible to invade like Russia or Afghanistan. Rather, it's the sheer number of people that live within its borders. Along with this population stands an industrial powerhouse. In fact, industry is 39.4% of the nation's GDP. Although that number has been steadily dropping since 2010, the mechanisms are in place to theoretically produce the largest army the world has ever seen. China has an aggregate land border length of around 13,743 miles. With this vast territory, China shares this border with 14 recognized countries, while Russia shares theirs with 16. Luckily for them, geography is on their side, something all three of the mentioned nations share. In this case, China is equipped with a 28,871-foot-high Himalayan underbelly, stretching for 1,550 miles from Afghanistan to Bhutan. Other parts of this notorious shell are the Pamir and Tian Shan mountain ranges. To the east, China has sea barriers like Russia, including the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea, not to mention the tropical landscape further south. And, just like Russia, there's one vast opening that leaves them vulnerable. For China, that happens to be the northern steppes of Mongolia. Unlike Russia, China has spent centuries fortifying this area. The most notable fortification is the Great Wall, a structure 13,171 miles in length. There are countless similarities between Russia and this latter comparison. Another notable one is their seemingly endless flow of natural resources. According to China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, these common threads have greatly strengthened relations over the last decade. This building of trust has resulted in a formal union between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, or BRICS for short. Currently, the formation is vague in its objectives, sharing principles of non-interference, equality, and mutual benefit. So far, it's difficult to discern whether or not this is posturing. If this group truly gains traction, then Western nations like the US could experience a pretty heavy economic hit, considering that BRICS makes up 27% of the world's land surface and 42% of the global population. On that note, it makes sense to compare Russia to its seemingly ancient foe, the United States of America. To begin, the capitalist and communist superpowers are more specifically like rivals than bile-tasting enemies. Both nations have shared interests in nuclear safety, space exploration, and counterterrorism since 1947. Their leaders have had dinner together, and dialogue remains mostly open. However, they are also far from being friends, often getting in each other's way at every possible turn. Russia's League of Nations rejection in the 1920s sparked resentment that seemingly continues to grow as decades pass. This had a lot to do with differences vastly eclipsing similarities. One of these is population and its role in society. With a population of 331.9 million, the US actually shares a similar voter turnout with Russia, fluctuating around 50%. While the Russian turnout was reported to be 51.72% in 2021. It should be noted that 2020 saw the US number jump to 66%. Turnout aside, the relationship between the governments and their people is vastly different. In Russia, although there seem to be 6 political parties in Russia's federal parliament, United Russia, Putin's party, reigns supreme. They work in tandem with Just Russia to control a combined 37.5% of party-nominated commissioners, who essentially determine the election process. The US doesn't have a clean election system, but there is a stark contrast between these two countries when it comes to overall control. Even outside of the voting booth, much of Russian society appears to act in unison, usually following mandates that would make the average American form a picket line. On the other hand, as far as defense is concerned, the defense budget difference between Russia and the US is truly remarkable. As of February 27, 2023, the budget for Russia is $66.4 billion, while the United States is $827 billion. For active personnel, we're looking at 1,190,000 for Russia and 1,359,600 for the US. While the Russian land power exceeds that of the US in number, 4,150 versus 2,959, the quality of each unit is night and day. Also, the US still surpasses their tank and artillery count by almost 1,500. With the amount that the US continues to pump into its defense, it's no wonder why it reigns supreme. So with this massive military, could the US or any other superpower successfully invade Russia now? Probably not. It's no secret that Russia is falling from its former Soviet pedestal. In the early days of the country's expansion, Moscow had no natural borders. They were forced to expand rapidly in a way that most countries never experienced. There are over 120 identifiable ethnic groups that surround the area, each with their own ideas for how a nation should function. For centuries, Russians would prevent a possible uprising by planting spies in these threatening territories. The purpose is to create dissonance and discourage collaboration. This not only allowed Russia to become the largest country on the planet, but it eventually led them to become the world's best espionage agency. At their height, thousands of spies were planted all over domestic and foreign territory. This gave Russia a web of information so thorough that they were able to eliminate every threat. Now, however, Russia is about to enter a counterfactual reality. All of the what-ifs are actually coming to fruition. After starting a war with Ukraine, all of Western Europe has ejected around 500 Russian diplomats, officials whose sole purpose, to begin with, was spying. The tendrils of Russia's vast intelligence network are beginning to shrivel under the solar flare that is unsanctioned annexation. This doesn't necessarily mean that the country is in the dark, but they are no longer able to stay 3 steps ahead like during the Cold War. Plus, there are no clear successors to Putin. He has been in power since 2000, and his death would leave a power vacuum nobody seems capable of filling. All of this might make one think that Russia is on its last leg. As far as the Russia you see today, there's a solid assessment. But that doesn't make invading Russia a good idea. As a matter of fact, an invasion would most likely make the country stronger than they've ever been before. It's a land that thrives on hardship. The only thing that appears to be tough enough to destroy Russia is Russia itself.